It's that time of year again. Spooky season. And so today, we decide which one of these books I'm going to be reading for the month of October. It's time to play Fiction Roulette, Horror Edition. So as always, I'm going to let the wheel decide what I'm going to read and review in the month of October. The wheel is filled with horror books that I'm excited to read. Hopefully these babies are gonna make me shit my pants. I spin the wheel 4 times each month. I usually read more than 4 books per month, but this thing just helps me to nail down, these are a handful of titles that no matter what, I'm definitely going to read. So I'm going to tell you what's on the wheel in a moment, but I just want to say I love Halloween, and I think that's because as an English kid growing up in the 1980s and the early 1990s, Halloween wasn't really a thing in England. And I really felt deprived of that fact, and it was especially harsh for an English kid growing up in that time because we were fully aware that Halloween existed in America. We had it shoved down our throats in these great movies like Hocus Pocus and Halloween Town and all these great kids horror films. What's that guy called? Is it Ernest Scared Stupid or something like that? All those cheesy kids films all about Halloween. And we saw all these little American kids enjoying trick-or-treating. And I remember saying to my mum once, why can't I go trick-or-treating, And she said, why don't you trick-or-treat your dad? I was like, Mum, I'm a kid. I'm not an idiot. And to make things even sweeter, to rub the salt into the wound even more, when I got a little bit older, Halloween started to become a big thing in England, and it came just in time for my little sisters, and every year I'd have to walk them around in their little costumes as they went trick-or-treating. Life just isn't fair, is it? But anyway, now that I'm older, I fully throw myself into the season. Every October, I get really into it. As you can probably see behind me, the whole house is decorated in Halloween stuff. I'm big into it. All right, anyway, let's talk about what the options are for the month of October and spooky season. First up is I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. So this is about a character named Robert Neville, who is the last person alive after a virus wipes out humanity and kind of transforms them into these vampire-like creatures. And he spends his days hunting them and his nights just staying inside to survive their attacks as they get animated at night. And it's really about, I think, this character, Robert Neville, dealing with being completely alone and fighting for survival every day. And I think it's mostly about the emotional toll that that can have on your psyche and the way that isolation sort of messes with your head after a while. Imagine being the last person on Earth. There's supposedly a good mixture in this book of sci-fi and horror, which kind of flips the vampire genre in a bit of a unique way. Plus, I saw the movie as well when it first came out with Will Smith. I really enjoyed it, but I've also heard that the book kind of has like a really different feel to it. And so I'm curious, to see how the book compares with the movie. The next book I'd love to read for spooky season is Rosemary's Baby by Ira Levin. So this is about a young couple who move into an old New York City apartment building, and this building has like a dark history. And shortly after settling in, Rosemary becomes pregnant, but she also begins to suspect that her husband and their sort of strange neighbors are involved in this conspiracy regarding her unborn child. And as her pregnancy progresses, she grows increasingly paranoid and isolated, feeling that maybe her baby might be some part of like a demonic plot. Just like I Am Legend, this book was adapted into a movie, but I've actually never seen the movie. And so I'm going to be going into this kind of cold, really. I'm excited to read this book because it's supposed to mess with your head. It's one of these like psychological horror stories that makes you question, is this narrator unreliable? Are they crazy? Is there something more going on? And it's also hugely important to the horror genre as a work of fiction. And so I think it's one of those books that really set the standard for everything that came after. The next book, this is a bit more modern. It's The Troop by Nick Cutter. So this is a story about a group of teenage boys who head off for a weekend camping trip on a remote island in the Canadian wilderness with their scoutmaster. They're all having fun, kind of enjoying their trip and independence away from their parents and their families. But then a stranger arrives and he's sick and he's kind of emaciated and he stumbles onto their island and he is carrying this highly contagious infection, which kind of turns you a little bit like animalistic. And so this group of boys and the scoutmaster are stranded with no way off of the island. And so now they're just trying to survive the infection, but also potentially each other as they start to fall victim to the virus. And so I'm really excited to read this because it's supposed to mix survival horror with very gruesome details. The idea of being trapped and isolated on an island with no help in sight. I love that kind of thing. It just gives you that dread, you know? The next book that I would love to read is The Haar by David Sodergren. So this is a book which is set in a town called Witch Haven, and this is like a small fishing village on the coast of Scotland where a character named Muriel has lived her whole life. She loves Witch Haven, you know, this is her home. She has no intention of ever leaving, but then when a property developer arrives with plans to tear down the entire village, she and everyone are about to be displaced. And just when it seems like she's about to lose her home and everything she loves, a strange fog begins to roll in from the sea. And this fog is known locally as the Haar. And with this fog, it brings with it a kind of like a strange power. And some see this fog as their salvation, while others descend into madness and like just a complete sense of chaos as this dark power seems to come from the mist. I read The Wasp Factory last month and I really enjoyed the setting of like a remote Scottish village. I just think it's like a perfect place for horror to play out. I think the common theme with all of these books seems to be isolation, you know, just being by yourself, not being able to escape that kind of claustrophobic feeling of being swamped. Yeah, that kind of thing gives me anxiety in the best way. David Sodergren also wrote Maggie's Grave, which I haven't read yet, but I've heard really good things about. And so if I like this book, then I'll definitely pick up a copy of Maggie's Grave as well. Maybe I'll read it next year for spooky season. Although if I really love this, I probably won't be able to wait that long, you know? Next book that I'd love to read is Brother by Anna Albarn. This is a horror novel about a very dysfunctional and deeply disturbing family that are living in rural West Virginia. And the protagonist, a character called Michael, was adopted by the family as a child. And he kind of struggles to fit in with their gruesome lifestyle. The family's got these cruel and twisted rituals that involve kidnapping and torturing innocent victims. I think it's supposed to be mostly young women that they capture. And Michael doesn't really want to follow in his family's footsteps. And so when he meets and kind of like falls for a young girl who lives in town, he's conflicted between loyalty to his adopted family and also his like growing sense of morality. I'm really excited to read this one. Sounds pretty messed up. I've heard that the horror is intense and graphic and that the novel sort of pushes the boundaries in a way that is not for the faint of heart. I'm also really interested to see how the story tackles the theme of like nature versus nurture, exploring whether Michael can break away from his twisted environment or is he doomed to follow in their footsteps. People that have read this book say that the suspense like builds throughout the book and it's supposed to be absolutely wild and has a crazy ending. The next book I'd love to read, and honestly it's a little bit mad that I haven't read this before, Something Wicked This Way Comes by Ray Bradbury. So this is a dark fantasy novel about two 13-year-old boys named Will and Jim who come across this mysterious traveling carnival that suddenly appears in their town. And the carnival's leader seems to have like an ability to grant people's wishes, but as always in these situations, there's a price to pay. And as the boys dig deeper into the dark secrets of the carnival, they find themselves in like a battle between good and evil, with their lives and their souls of the townspeople hanging in the balance. So I think the reason that I'm mostly excited to read this is because of Ray Bradbury's prose. He's got such a poetic way of bringing characters and places to life. Also, carnivals are always creepy, aren't they? So this next book is one that I'm probably most excited to read, and it is The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty. It's one of the most famous horror books of all time. I think in large part due to the movie that was adapted after its publication. And the novel is centered around the possession of a 12-year-old girl named, I think it's Reagan McNeil. And as Reagan's behavior becomes increasingly terrifying and violent, her desperate mother seeks out the help from a priest who he himself is sort of like grappling with his own crisis of faith alongside Father Merrin, who is like this experienced exorcist. And they confront this ancient evil in a battle for Reagan's soul, sort of like at the same time, they're testing the boundaries of their faith. Is their faith really strong enough to confront this kind of evil? You know, this is always listed as one of the scariest books of all time. I saw a review of this book where the reviewer said that it's the only time they've ever cried reading a book, not out of like compassion or heartbreak or anything like that, but out of just pure fear. They just started crying out of fear. In a weird way, I sort of want that to happen to me. I doubt it's going to get. I'm not that susceptible usually to horror to that extent, but we'll see. I would love to feel terrified. That's the reason I'm reading these books. Do you know what I mean? It's supposed to be every bit as terrifying as the movie, if not more so. And again, this is the book that I'm most hoping comes up on the wheel. The next book I'd love to read for October is The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor LaVille. And this is a reimagining of H.P. Lovecraft's The Horror at Red Hook. It's told from the perspective of Tommy Tester, who is a street musician in the 1920s in Harlem. And he kind of gets involved with dark and ancient forces that are beyond his understanding. That's when this wealthy occultist hires him for this like mysterious job, and Tommy finds himself drawn into a world of eldritch horrors and cosmic evil. I'm really interested, I think, mostly in the atmospheric setting of the 1920s Harlem, combined with like the supernatural elements. I'm always flirting with cosmic horror and have been for a while now. Sometimes I love it. Other times it doesn't quite land for me. Usually it all goes a bit mental at the end and I sort of lose touch with it a bit. I read The Fisherman recently and I loved that. That brought me back on board. I don't know, maybe The Ballad of Black Tom could be the one that tips the scales and makes me an official fan of cosmic horror. We shall see. The next book I'd love to read is Carrie by Stephen King. You knew I was going to include some Stephen King. How could I not include a little bit of Stephen King, you know? I've read maybe 30, somewhere between 30 and 40 Stephen King books, but somehow I've never got around to reading his debut novel, Carrie. This book is about a shy, outcast teenage girl named Carrie White, who is just being like relentlessly bullied at school, and she's harshly controlled by her fanatically religious mother. And as Carrie's emotions kind of reach a breaking point, she discovers that she has telekinetic powers, which give her the ability to move objects with her mind. She's the victim of this cruel prank at a school prom that just pushes her over the edge. I am. Just through pop culture, I know what this prank is. You know, it's kind of been recreated in so many different other shows, and you know, it's always referenced as this big classic moment in horror. So I'm aware what the prank is. And at that moment, Carrie kind of like uses her powers to exact her revenge on those who have tormented her. So in my opinion, no self-respecting Stephen King fan should leave this book off of their list. After I've read it, I think that I'm finally I think it's going to be time for me to release like a Stephen King tier list where I rank all of the Stephen King books that I've read. So if you're interested in seeing that, make sure to subscribe because I'll be releasing it pretty much as soon as I've read Carrie, either this month or, you know, if it doesn't come up on the wheel, then I'll read it next month at some point. I'm going to be reading it in the near future, one way or another. The next book I'd love to read, this is supposedly one of the scariest books that's been released in recent times, and that's The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. This book follows 4 Native American men who are haunted by this violent event from their past. And years after hunting on this forbidden patch of land that's supposed to be exclusively used by their elders in their tribe, they find themselves stalked by this vengeful entity that's seeking retribution. And then one by one, they face the consequences of that day where they broke the rules. And the story goes into themes of like their cultural identity and generational trauma and survival. I think that the novel kind of weaves traditional Native American storytelling with modern horror. I read Mapping the Interior recently by Stephen Graham Jones. You know, honestly, I didn't love it. But this author has such a huge reputation in the horror genre, so I want to give him another chance, at least one more chance, to see if I gel more with his writing style this time. Apparently, this book is just one of those horror novels that stays with you a long time after you've finished it, and I'd really love to have that experience. So yeah, those are the contestants for the month of October. So it's time to spin the wheel and play fiction roulette. So yeah, let's see the first book that I'm going to be reading for spooky season. All right, here we go. I'm going to be reading Carrie by Stephen King. I can't get away from this guy, you know? I read a Stephen King book every month, pretty much. I couldn't be happier. Okay, next up. Something Wicked This Way Comes by Ray Bradbury. Awesome. I'm starting to get, at this point, I'm excited, right, to read these 2 books, but I also have this sense of loss, you know, like, oh, we're starting to get closer to the, you know, we're halfway through, and I start to think of all the books that maybe I won't necessarily be reading. I don't know. I'm definitely going to read 4 of these books, but they're quite short. A lot of these books are quite short. And so maybe I'll read more. I might read 6 or 7 of them. Who knows? But yeah, still, I start getting a little bit nervous at this point. Okay, so let's find out the 3rd book that I'm going to be reading in the month of October. Something Wicked This Way Comes again. All right, so let's try it again. That always happens, man. That always happens. I always get at least 1 repeat. All right, let's try again. I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. So, that's going to be great. All right, I'm excited about that one. I think this was a big inspiration for Salem's Lot as well, which I really enjoyed. So, yeah, That's gonna be cool. I'm looking at the pile so far. Pretty excited. All right, here we go. Last one. Carrie. All right. Again, another repeat. Let's try again. Here we go. The Exorcist. Oh, by the way, I should. We always go by this dongle, right? So you might have gone, oh, it's going to be Ballad of Black Tom. No, we always go by the dongle. I should have mentioned that in the beginning. Every month we go by the dongle, I promise. I'm not just leaning towards The Exorcist. That is the official rules. I'll be honest with you. I don't think that could have gone any better. Like, that's the best case scenario, I think. So, yeah. By the way, just quickly, this time last year, I focused on completely classic horror. I read Dracula, I read Frankenstein, I read The King in Yellow, and I'm actually a little bit proud of those book reviews that I made. And so if you'd like to watch that video series where I review the best of classic horror throughout time, and if you'd like to maybe read some of those books in spooky season, then you can click up here to see that video series. Thanks so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it. And as always, happy reading and happy spooky season.